Hello, everyone. I'm Kevin Gosztola, managing editor of Shadowproof. Glad to be here sharing with you some of the reporting from day 13 of Julian Assange's extradition trial. And thank you for everyone who is engaging with my coverage, all the support that I'm receiving. I'm getting messages from some very wonderful people. And I'll note Liam's kind message here, appreciating my time and effort that I'm putting into covering this case. Thank you for that acknowledgement. So let's get to what happened on day 13. It was a shorter day, and also there were two witnesses. They were both doctors. One was a prosecution witness. The other one was a defense witness. So the first person to take the witness stand was actually there, present at the Old Bailey Courthouse in London. He is Dr. Nigel Blackwood. He was a medical expert that was commissioned by the prosecution to conduct a second psychiatric assessment of Julian Assange. So in addition to Sina Fazel, this is another doctor. Sina Fazel was a doctor we had on day 12. This was another doctor that could provide some information on Julian Assange's condition that the prosecution could use. He completed a phone assessment in July of 2020. So it was also fairly recent. And a lot of the back and forth between the defense and prosecutors is what they should focus on and what they shouldn't focus on. The prosecutors want to focus on his condition now, which is much better. The defense wants to say, well, let's go back to December 2019 in November. It was quite bleak, and that shows you what isolation was doing to him. He was put into a hospital unit that had segregation, and this reflects part of the isolation that he would likely experience in a U.S. prison. And they're saying that matters, that should be a factor in not approving the extradition of Julian Assange to the United States. So we had this doctor who took the stand, Nigel Blackwood, and there are a few takeaways that I have from it as I go through my thread here. He essentially did not agree with Professor Michael Kopelman, who had diagnosed Julian Assange as having severe depression. So he said it was more of a moderate kind of depression. He did, note some of the other aspects of his mental health that are agreed upon, but he, also did not agree that Julian Assange should be diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome, which was a diagnosis that was made by Quentin Deely. They looked at the same report. He looked at the same test, but he said he was hesitant to make this diagnosis because Julian Assange is 49 years old and he had gone through, he's been hospitalized before. He wondered why doctors would be giving him this diagnosis now. So before commenting on any of that, some more that I would share from this is that the defense confronted Blackwood on his view, the way he was describing the conditions that Julian Assange would face at the Alexandria Detention Center. This is the facility we already know about because Chelsea Manning was confined there for about a year as she was resisting a grand jury subpoena. And this is the facility. It's linked into the Eastern District of Virginia. It's where he would be confined as he waited for trial. And it's the assistant U.S. Attorney Gordon Kromberg's position that there's no solitary confinement at this facility, which is simply false. And we know that because Paul Manafort was held at this facility. And we know that Maria Butina were held at this facility too. Both of them were held there, and they were in solitary confinement. Butina described her condition to James Bamford and what it was like. And in fact, I added it to the thread of my coverage today because it was baffling the way in which this medical expert was taking the prosecutor the prosecution's testimony at face value. This prosecutor, who has an incentive to call it something else, is essentially, that's what it is. In my view, it's the U.S. government doesn't call it solitary confinement. Their words are administrative segregation, and so that's how they can claim it doesn't exist. But Maria herself says she was put in a 7 by 10 foot room with a steel door, cement bed, 2 narrow windows, each 3 inches wide. She was only allowed outside for a total of 45 minutes. And then in another part of this article that was written by James Bamford for the New Republic, called The Spy Who Wasn't, she talks about how she slept on a blue mat atop the gray cement bed in her cell. And then she was actually moved to another cell at one point that had a solid steel door, no food slot. She was prevented from even the slightest communication. There was no reason given. She's marched around in this unit where there are cells for isolation, and they were trying to coerce her into pleading guilty, which is also relevant to this case, because I think a good argument can be made that if Julian Assange was brought to the U.S., he would be under immense pressure to not go to trial and challenge his charges in a U.S. courtroom. It's what all defendants face. There's something known as the trial tax. If you plead guilty early, you have a lower sentence. If you go to trial, then the prosecutors go more aggressively after you and try to get a lengthier sentence. So we go through all of this with Blackwood. The defense is challenging his assessment of U.S. prison conditions, of which he is not an expert. He is taking the prosecution at face value, at what they have said. He is giving them more preference than the other defense experts that have actually studied and have some experience, even as administrators in these prison facilities. And so that was what the defense was trying to deal with and handle during the afternoon. Eventually, they were able to, Edward Fitzgerald was able to get Blackwood to concede that if he was put in special administrative measures in the Supermax prison in Florence, Colorado, that in fact, this would be something that would have a deleterious effect on Julian Assange and his mental health. So it was difficult, but yet, I mean, I was troubled by the exchange when Fitzgerald put the statistic to Blackwood that around half of the suicides in U.S. prisons are from the 3 to 8% of prisoners who are in isolation. And the response from this medical expert was that, well, we have to keep in mind that the base rate of suicide in American prisons is considerably less than in the United Kingdom, which is a very dry, kind of cold way of talking about all of this. It removes the humanity, and I also, don't think he's necessarily taking away the right thing from this statistic. I mean, that he's basically denying the significance of this statistic, and it's hugely troubling. And I have my own concerns, though I haven't spent any time investigating what it's like in British prisons, but I am concerned for people in Britain that perhaps the prisons are on this slow, gradual path of becoming more like U.S. prisons, and I'm fearful. I'm fearful for what that would mean, because the mass incarceration system here in the United States is responsible for so much inhumanity on a daily basis that I don't really want to see that replicated in other settings. And supposedly there have always been human rights considerations when it came to confinement in Britain. I wouldn't want to see those fall away, yet this medical expert was talking about how people with depression could be kept in isolation and managed fairly well, and that the risk of suicide could be modified and they could actually be kept in isolation. So it wasn't you couldn't just say putting somebody in isolation meant that their depression would be exacerbated and they would possibly be triggered to commit suicide. So in any case, this was the witness. And there's one more thing that is important to get to that needs to be highlighted, which is that Blackwood said something when we started about how there was video there was a video that leaked of I think it was Assange inside of the Belmarsh prison, and it was his testimony when he talked to the prosecutor that the video footage leak was why Julian Assange was moved to the healthcare department and put into those more isolating conditions so that he could receive care and attention. And the defense came back and said, here is a report from April 18th that says when he was moved, he was in a he's very low in his mood. He had thoughts of self-harm and suicide that were hard for him to control. And there was a conversation with Assange about whether he would like to go to the healthcare department. And in the afternoon on that day, it was basically decided, I think, or eventually after this, it moved on and he was moved to the healthcare unit. Well, how can Blackwood say that Julian Assange was moved to the healthcare unit and that it had to do with possible reputational damage to Belmarsh? And so they put Julian Assange in the healthcare unit, which, on one hand, I say that sounds kind of retaliatory. Like maybe they're doing what I've seen done in U.S. prisons here. But it was actually for health reasons. There's documentation with the doctors that he was there. So what's going on here? Is there some kind of effort to conceal that Julian Assange was moved to the healthcare unit in Belmarsh? Because if that's in the record, that might clearly help him defeat his extradition request to the United States. I can't answer that question at this moment, but I think it's certainly one that needs to be explored. It may be the focus of my written report for today because this seems like quite an issue. Although we had compelling testimony from Dr. Sandra Crosby. So let me move on to what she had to say, and then I will get to all of your questions because I think that it's worth it to engage with you and talk to you about some of the things that are important to you all in this case. So Dr. Sandra Crosby met with Julian Assange multiple times. She was part of a group of doctors that visited him in the Ecuador embassy. She described in some pretty good detail from her report, although this is a report. All of these reports from the doctors are not being made public to the press for reasons of trying to be sensitive and respectful to Assange, given these are very private medical issues that we are seeing and hearing about in detail in this courtroom, and that material does not need to be widely available to everyone throughout the world. I'm respectful of that. But so we've actually gotten some more detail from these statements on the fact that they're not going to be available to us, which is maybe a little bit like backward, but in any case, it's helpful to us as reporters who are trying to follow what's going on here with the prosecution. And so anyways, the Dr. Sandra Crosby is from the United States. And in October 2017, she visited the Ecuador embassy. At that time, it had been about 5.5 years that Julian Assange had been in the embassy. She was there as part of a kind of academic evaluation, she said, of the effects of living inside of this embassy. She also went to see Assange twice in October 2019 and January 2020 in the Belmarsh prison. Her view is that she found symptoms of depression, PTSD, in 2017, and then she was concerned there was really no way to perform evaluation. She had some testimony about his physical state, in addition to his mental state that we had not heard about, such as Julian Assange having osteoporosis, a history of dealing with cracked ribs, and how vulnerable he would be if he was extradited to a U.S. prison in that regard, because of the healthcare. It's not even fair to call it poor. It's punishing, your efforts to try to get healthcare in a U.S. facility are grueling, and you have to basically keep working at it until you finally might receive some kind of serious medical attention. Excuse me. So when in 2018 she met with Assange, he was describing thoughts of suicide to her. And in fact, he apparently said something about Slobodan Praljak's suicide in the UN War Crimes Tribunal, because there's video of it where he poisoned himself in the middle of that proceeding and committed suicide, so he didn't have to face justice. And this is something Assange was apparently contemplating as a way out. In February 2019, he had deteriorated more physically and psychologically. February 2019 would have been just a couple months before he was expelled from the Ecuador embassy, if we're keeping the timeline straight in our heads. He had an advanced tooth infection and was taking narcotics to try and deal with it. She could not get him to go outside of the embassy to receive care because, again, very concerned he's going to be extradited to the United States. So we get some more details. She echoes some what we've heard from other doctors about the threat of extradition being a trigger for a suicide attempt if he is brought to the United States. And then the prosecutors spent some time cross-examining her. There's not a whole lot to take away from it, although James Lewis is particularly upset and distraught over the Nils Meltzer report. Nils Meltzer is the UN Special Rapporteur on Torture. This has come up a few times. He thinks it's completely imbalanced and unfair. And so Crosby talked a bit about how Meltzer got involved because, in his mind, James Lewis blames this doctor for Nils Meltzer being involved. And she said that, after this February 2019 visit, when I saw Assange, I thought there was a big risk of systemic infection and death. I was afraid he might overdose on the narcotics. I went to the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights and asked for some help in being involved in the case. And then Nils Meltzer later on did go meet with Assange at the Belmarsh prison. So that's what unfolded. There's something that Crosby left out that I want to get to and highlight, but let me take a few questions here and I'll come back to it before wrapping. So let me go back up here and see how we're starting with were Stella and Christian Harafson not permitted to sit directly in the court as of yesterday? So the answer to that question is we've had the judge more strictly enforcing social distancing, and I'm not sure that there is space in the seating for Christian. And so it's been a choice. I noticed another person I recognize, Joseph Farrell, who is with the defense. So these people who have been sitting over there, some of them had to move, and I don't know if they ended up in another room. But the judge has been more stringent. If you look at cases of COVID-19 in the UK right now, they're around the 4,000 a day mark of new cases that are being documented by the World Health Organization site. They're spiking. And so it's something she's trying to ensure that an outbreak doesn't happen at the courthouse and make it impossible for us to complete this trial. Did the court give any explanation why it refuses Amnesty International and other organizations access to watch the court proceedings? Thus far, we have not returned to that. That was a day, the first day they handled that and said that they believed it was a court administration error that 40 organizations and trial observers were inappropriately granted access. It's never been really laid out what she thinks went wrong. This is her view. This is how she has managed and limited access to this case. It definitely undermines what the British system considers to be principles of open justice. So when I made my application or request to the British court, and I wanted to have remote video access, and I did this before we knew that the court was going to go ahead and have video access for people during the COVID-19 pandemic. I didn't want to travel, because as we're seeing now, these cases are spiking in and around the courthouse. So I was appealing to the sense of open justice that the system is supposed to have. It certainly undermines open justice to not allow Amnesty International into that courtroom. They've been protesting. Other organizations have been trying to challenge. There were politicians, parliamentarians that have had their access limited. And so I don't know where things stand with this. There's not a lot of ways that these organizations can challenge being kept out from following these proceedings. Some of them can go to the courthouse physically. They can send representatives, but there are a very limited number of seats for people at this time. So that's an issue. It's definitely an issue that has to be dealt with. How is Julian looking? I can't imagine how he must be feeling having his medical records be discussed publicly, as well as being accused of faking his mental health issues. Indeed, his partner, Stella Morris, pointed out on the second day of this medical testimony that they're essentially losing the last and final shreds of privacy that they had. They already had very little privacy, this being such a public case, this being so high profile, it being the fact that he lived inside of the Ecuador embassy, all of that, it's certainly a concern. And as they've shown him, I can't say he's enjoying it. He looks like, I'm sure this is not where he wants to be spending his time. And so that's the best way I can answer that question. As far as appearances go, he's having to sit there, as you point out, and hear about his medical history over and over again. And that isn't something that anyone is going to enjoy. And I mean, do you think, and obviously, like, now all of us know that he has osteoporosis. All of us know that he's got heart problems, and he's, I think, though, more so than us in the public knowing that information, he's concerned about people who have always come after him in bad faith and how they might use this medical evidence. So it being more widely available, WikiLeaks having a lot of detractors and people who he's concerned that this will be used against him in ways that are very negative. Court started later than usual today. Is it going to be the same tomorrow as well? No, we're going to start about the same time at 10 a.m. I'll be up much more early. I appreciated the sleep today. So let me take a moment to work in, as we're closing this bit, that I'm a little bit stunned that the defense left out, but they may feel that there are other witnesses that are better equipped to deal with this. But she had her own experience, and I thought that it would have been good to share, although maybe there's no evidence to tie what happened to the U.S. government. But here, I'll just say that Sandra Crosby, when she visited in February 2019, there was an experience she had in the embassy, excuse me, that suggests that there was embassy surveillance staff that violated Julian Assange's doctor-patient confidentiality. She described in an affidavit that she wrote that what happened was she left the room to get some food because Mr. Assange had not eaten. Returning to the embassy, in the meeting room, I discovered my confidential medical notes had been removed. The notes were located in a space utilized by embassy surveillance staff and had presumably been read. Mr. Assange's right to doctor-patient confidentiality was violated, and his confidential information had been breached. In addition, upon my return to the embassy, after obtaining food for Mr. Assange, I was questioned by the security staff and was forced to write a statement as to who I was and the purpose of my visit, which had already been established. I was asked for a copy of my medical license, which was taken and photocopied. My passport and phone had been taken earlier. The embassy security guard then told me he had to, quote, make a call, end quote, before I would be allowed back in the embassy to complete my evaluation. I was not informed who he was calling or why. The experience was intimidating. So I add that there because it's definitely relevant. Through all of this, what we've heard from at least from these doctors is Julian Assange has this constant concern that he's going to be sharing how he's doing mentally and or physically with these doctors, and that's going to get passed back to the CIA. And I think, given what he's been through, that's not entirely an unfounded bit of paranoia to be under. And obviously, we could debate whether that is paranoia. I mean, in the Belmarsh setting, it's less likely. In the Ecuador embassy, it was extremely likely. It was extremely likely. All of those papers, everything that was going on in that, all of those materials about his health, people he was meeting with, anything in his daily life, it's in the hands of U.S. intelligence agencies, and it's for the prosecution's case. There are no boundaries. All the boundaries were violated. So let me get to a few remaining questions, and then I will wrap it up for today. So thank you for following. Some questions that we have are, there's a suggestion that Baretzer and the prosecutor have been more quiet in the last few days. Do you feel there's a shift in momentum, a chance for a positive outcome in this kangaroo court? It's hard to judge based on individual days. I think the most important thing is that I've seen a shift in Vanessa Baretzer's attitude by the judge that this needs to be wrapped up in the next week, that we need to speed things along. We got to the end of the day and she was like, do you have anything else for me? Give me some statements. We entered some witness statements that were fairly meaningless to, they weren't that significant. It was like verifying WikiLeaks material in the Internet Archive, and it was the Cryptome founder about publishing the unredacted cables on the Cryptome website and what date. We've already heard this evidence. It's just establishing it. It's procedural, kind of pretty mundane. And yet she says, can we get through this? So searching for things we could get through in order to accomplish all of this. What more can we do? Every day going forward is going to be, is there any other witnesses? Is there any other material we can enter in the record? How can we make this faster? Tomorrow we're going to hear from Patrick Eller, who is an expert, has looked over the court-martial record or the trial for Chelsea Manning's proceedings, and will be going through and addressing the computer crime charge against Julian Assange and showing meticulously, I imagine, with computer forensic evidence that there isn't much of a basis for this charge against Julian Assange, that the prosecutors can't prove what they're alleging, that they probably don't even really understand what they're alleging because it didn't happen the way they're trying to lay it out. And this will go to the misrepresentation of facts in the case, why the charge is not legitimate to be brought against Assange. Again, this goes to the password hash and whether he was helping Chelsea Manning to move about anonymously in the U.S. military computer system. And as I wrap up, so if you would like to, there's a button, I imagine, on YouTube right below this where you can click and subscribe. What I will do after I get done is I will put a playlist together of all of the video reports. This is something I could have done a long time ago, but a lot I've been doing. So I'm going to go back and put all the video reports in one playlist so you can catch up on all the daily reports. And then that would be a way to access previous reports that you haven't seen. And yeah, it's pretty upsetting for his family to hear all about this. Kind comment about the severe infection in the tooth is very dangerous, causes extreme infection spreading to the glass. Yeah, it's extremely, you have to deal with that. Final question. Do you think prosecutor realizes that the style of questioning is not appreciated by the UK judge and not yielding results he wants? So I've heard that the way he's behaving is outside of what normally would be done in the courtroom. It's hard for me to judge how it is wearing on Vanessa Baraitser, simply because she still seems more concerned with managing and interrupting the defense than she does in stopping the prosecutor from being aggressive towards the witnesses. She isn't reading too much into the impoliteness of James Lewis. She's more focused on the content of questions that are put to witnesses, whether they're unreasonable or unreasonable. I will say that she seems to be preempting prosecutors' interruptions now, kind of anticipating what the prosecution might object to before they even object. And that's a new dynamic in these proceedings. It is frustrating for the defense. The flow of some of their cross-examinations or the questionings of witnesses are disrupted and become difficult as she says, well, you can't really ask that. You have to ask it in a different way. And judges do this all the time. It's fairly routine, but she's doing it more often. And it's definitely worth noting that it is happening more often in these extradition proceedings. All right, well, everyone, I appreciate all of the support, seeing as I've been going for a half hour and I have a written report to write for day 13. I'm going to get to work. I also have something special that will be posted here within the next 12 hours, an interview that I'm going to be pleased to share. Once again, if you want to get the written reports that I'm doing daily, please go to dissenter.substack.com/subscribe. You'll get those into your inbox. You don't have to go hunting. You'll get what I'm covering. Yesterday, the report that I did was about the Asperger's syndrome diagnosis and what that may mean, because there are two other cases, the Gary McKinnon case and the Lori Love case, that are precedents in the UK, and they beat US extradition requests because they were diagnosed with Asperger's syndrome. Certainly a factor. I think it could play a role in this extradition trial, and the appeals process definitely will come up. And Edward Fitzgerald, who is on Assange's legal team, was involved in arguing on behalf of Lori Love and winning that case and making arguments very similar to what we've heard so far in this trial. All right, I'm going to go. Thank you all for following along. I appreciate all your support, the very kind messages. You're all very wonderful people, and I'll be back again tomorrow on day 14 to cover Julian Assange's extradition trial.